Hello, my American Studies 340 students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. Welcome again to the course. This is week one. Um, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to do a week one lecture, which is not really a lecture, it's just basically a summary of expectations for the week. And I'm going to do one that specifically goes over the syllabus and goes over what we're doing in this course. For week one, your readings really are about the origins of public education in HBCUs in the U.S. in the period roughly after 1865. And then you're going to ask me, of course, what, there weren't any public schools in the United States before 1865? There weren't any black colleges and universities in the U.S. 1865? The answer to the question, of course, is yes, there were both. There's a rolling argument between essentially three different universities, three different HBCUs around the origins of HBCUs. It's Lincoln University in Missouri, Lincoln University in southeastern Pennsylvania, where I've actually been on campus to do the first conference presentation I ever did in my life was in 1992. May of 1992, I had just finished my master's degree. Yes, I'm that old. And I went to Lincoln University to do a presentation on multiculturalism and influences of black intellectuals in the development of multiculturalism in the early 20th century in the United States. And, of course, there's a third university known as Wilberforce from Ohio. They all argue that they were founded somewhere around 1853 or 1854. They're all basically founded within an 18-month period of each other. I'm not going to engage over which one was founded first. I don't really care. I don't think you should in the whole scheme of things either. It's more trivia than reality. But, yes, there was. There are also public schools in the United States prior to 1865. Some semblance of public schools occur in parts of western Massachusetts and in Boston at various periods throughout the 17th, 18th, and even 19th century, of course, in Massachusetts. There's some semblance of public schools in places like Georgetown, when Georgetown was still an incorporated city and separate from Washington, D.C., as well as places like New York and Philadelphia and other places. But they're not public schools as we know it, meaning that taxpayer dollars pay for your ability to go to these schools, and that everyone was expected to go to public school between the ages of 5 and 16 or 17. Those ideas around compulsory public schooling are actually 20th century ideas. They don't occur for most students until the 1920s and 30s. So, as such, the public school that we understand public schools to be in an American context doesn't exist until the 20th century. But how do we get there? How we get there is really related to issues around race and around class. And around gender, but primarily race and class. And that's not just blacks and whites, that's white ethnics who aren't Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right, versus whites who are Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? All of that's really wrapped up in the development of public schools in the period roughly between 1865 and 1920. In the 1920s, compulsory schooling starts to take over in state after state across the United States and in the District of Columbia. So, and by the way, African Americans are very much involved in that process, particularly in what used to be the Confederacy part of the Union during the period after the Civil War, the U.S. South. That they are central to the development of public schools in the South. And some of the readings that you have for this week are really about the centrality of activism, political activism, and cultural activism among African Americans, among formerly enslaved black folk who now are freed folk living in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and Florida, and South Carolina, North Carolina, and even in Virginia, and to some extent even in Washington, D.C. and Maryland, who all are pushing for education in order to wipe out illiteracy. Illiteracy that was forced upon them because of slave codes and slave laws, which prohibited masters, prohibited folks who were literate from teaching enslaved blacks to read and write. By the way, there are definitely 5% of black population who live in the South still learn how to read and write anyway, partly because some masters defy that order in order to have enslaved folks who could actually do work for them, literate work for them. Some slaves learned on their own because they were taught by other folks who were free or enslaved, who actually figured out how to read and write, sometimes on their own, sometimes spontaneously. Some people are that smart, by the way. So, and this is really a campaign of literacy. So the steps that lead to public education in a huge chunk in the United States are in part on the backs of African Americans, on the backs of freed blacks working for literacy, working to learn how to read and write. And at the same time, on the other end of things, the founding of HBCUs in places like Tennessee and Arkansas and Georgia and other places is also based on this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps educationally in order to use education as an offensive weapon for social and cultural mobility among black folk. And so your readings for this week are about literacy on the one hand, basic literacy, reading and writing skills to support a population of folks who do not want to be enslaved economically or politically, to folks who want to be fully engaged in making America great for the first time, to take a phrase from our modern times, around social mobility, cultural development, having a learned population which could help others educate themselves, keep that process of literacy going beyond its initial steps, and to really fight for equality within American society. So the project of building HBCUs is not separate from the project of establishing public schools in the South. They, in fact, are part of a grand plan of using education as sort of a leveler, a social equalizer. But if you also understand the readings, you also understand the fact that that's only part of the equation. That in point of fact, if there are forces in play around, specifically systemic racism and the folks who practice systemic racism at the political level, to keep blacks as undereducated as possible, because you need those folks as part of a populace that you want to employ in the lowest level work possible by making as much profit off of them as possible. In other words, to keep them in some sort of servitude that might not be slavery, but might not feel like slavery, but is close enough to where you can maximize profitability, especially in a region of the country in which folks are suffering economically. The South doesn't become poor because people are ignorant and stupid, which is a stereotype that many people have of the South. The South is poor because all of a sudden $4 billion worth of slaves is gone. That property value is gone. So these people that used to be property are not property anymore, and as such, you have lost value. And between that and the Civil War, the destruction of the Civil War and the fighting of the Civil War, destruction of factories, of farms, of plantations, of railroad ties, of bridges and roads, and so forth, plunges the South essentially into a depression that it doesn't fully, truly recover from until after World War II. Right, so nearly 100 years of economic underdevelopment that's actually made worse by Jim Crow segregation and by the sharecropping system in order to maximize profit and income for former plantation owners, former slave owners who still own the land, and at the same time keep so many people in some form of subservience. By the way, just as an aside, 2/3 of folks who were in the sharecropping system are white. So most sharecroppers are actually white, and yet they're supporting their own servitude, a relative economic servitude, because they also want to make sure that blacks do not receive a proper education, a proper economic worth in terms of pay as sharecroppers, as tenant farmers, and so on and so forth. So it's a very brutal system in that sense. And the connection between that, the tension between social control using education as a tool of social control by underfunding education, by segregating education, by excluding certain people from educational institutions, particularly institutions of higher learning, from high schools, and so on and so forth, is paired with the African American effort to make education work for them in order to have economic development, social development, cultural development, and use all of that to try to achieve equality within a system that's specifically meant to keep them from achieving such. And so the Rabinowitz reading, the James Anderson reading, the Teresa Perry readings are really all about the tension between those two. I am only requiring you for the purposes of discussion to read a Rabinowitz reading for week 1. However, in terms of your first reflections for week 1, which are due at the end of this week, that would be August the 30th. That's August the 30th, Sunday, August the 30th by 11:59 p.m. I do want you to reflect on what your knowledge is of this type of material going into this first week and be able to talk to, if not all 3, at least 2 of the 3 readings. So Rabinowitz and either Perry or Rabinowitz or Anderson in terms of your reflections. So that's what I'm expecting you to do this week. But make no mistake, this is where the modern tension that we have in our education system, from pre-K or preschool, from the time you're 3 or 4 years old, whether you were in a Head Start program, if you were below the threshold in terms of the poverty line, or some fancy schmancy, we teach you the difference between fork settings and spoon settings, daycare, all the way up through graduate school. Race is involved in that process. The racism is involved in that process. And you might not believe that's involved in that process because, I didn't have to deal with race growing up. Well, just because someone didn't call you the N-word doesn't mean you didn't have to deal with race. It's not the most obvious thing always. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's not so subtle, right? Just to use another quick example before I cut off for this particular week, Black in the Ivy became a meme and became a series of Instagram postings that still has been continuing for the last 3 months since George Floyd's murder, if you will, at the hands of Minneapolis police back in May. And all of that reflects how in subtle and not so subtle ways the macroaggressions and microaggressions that Black students, that students of color more generally, have had to deal with in higher ed, but also, because I also follow some of this stuff with high school students and middle school students, how some of them have had to deal with some of these assumptions of Black intellectual inferiority and lack of attention to, the importance of education and so on and so forth. When in point of fact, the history shows quite differently and quite vividly that African Americans, that Black folk have always been concerned about the quality of education. They've been given quality and have demanded more quality of education oftentimes than they've been able to get out of governments, out of school districts, out of individual educators, and so on and so forth. And so that tension with social mobility and social control shows up as early as the period immediately after Civil War and emancipation, and it's still with us, obviously, 155 or so years later.